One of the extraordinary facts of investigative pursuits is that historical research has become a significant part of it for the first time. The attempts in the last 10, 15, 20 years to revisit areas which it was conveniently thought had been solved, that all questions had been answered, is now open to serious questioning. I made some notes just quickly before I came about the subjects that people have begun to look at in earnest and have done for the last while. And I say that as a way of introducing this really interesting and excellent book that opens exactly this area up for inspection. This substratum of investigative stuff really attempts to puncture illusions and fraudulent interpretations of history. The first that I came across immediately was Paul Foote. Many of you will know who he was. He was probably the largest award for investigative journalism in Britain is done in his name. And he spent a large part of his life, besides investigating all sorts of crimes and social injustices in Britain, investigating what happened to Shelley's political poetry. And he wrote an excellent book called Red Shelley, which was precisely an elegant and descriptive analysis of why his most potent and virulent material was never published. It was, in fact, it was ignored for 80 years. He spent a lot of time looking at a curious military defeat when a huge British detachment, military detachment, set sail for Dominica to fight the black general Toussaint Louverture, and were sadly defeated in 10 days. This entire huge British well-trained army under a very good General Maitland was just devastated by the crazed black figure coming out of the jungle. Nobody knew who he was, and this had to be hidden. And so the subsequent history, particularly in the Times, was wonderful. It described, as I remember this, like the defeats suffered by the Spanish and the French armies before and after. The British catastrophe had to be disguised and subverted. The stunning military victory against Leclerc and Maitland, celebrated in American and continental accounts, simply disappeared in Britain. In the British historical record, the British troops, the Times would write, became infected with mysterious illnesses and fell like flies. The entire British army, the Spanish army, and the French army were all defeated by this ragtag peasant army. Then, later on, on a rather more sober note, Adam Hochschild, an American investigative journalist, the publisher of a very good magazine called Mother Jones, decided he would go after King Leopold of the Congo. And before that, very little was known about this beneficent Christian figure who spread happiness and good works throughout the Congo. We now know, compliments of Hochschild, that he killed 10 million people. It was one of the largest massacres in human history. And that was a result of an investigation of this kind. And I'll just finish it with another odd one, which is curiously old, that I.F. Stone, one of the most articulate and interesting American investigative journalists, spent his last 2 or 3 years writing a book on Socrates, an investigation of the erroneous crimes attributed to him. And it is an entertaining and good read. But tonight, this is much more interesting than I.F. Stone's, Izzy Stone's book, because this deals with something right at home. And I would introduce our two speakers. Many of you will know who they are. But for those of you who may have forgotten who they are two very distinguished colleagues from World in Action, and who both had spent many, many years in probably the finest investigative operation in this country has ever mounted. And having said all of that, I'd like to introduce them so they can tell you about this extraordinary book. Go ahead.
Well, this book began not as a book, but began as a TV documentary. This is what we thought. Its origins are Australia. I was in Australia on holiday. My wife is Australian, and I was in that wonderful institution, the Mitchell Library in Sydney. And I came across there, understandably, the Australians are kind of interested in convicts and transportation, and they have a vast collection on convicts and transportation. And I came across an astonishing book. It was very old, very obscure, and it amazed me. It told of how women were in the 18th and 17th centuries were, and children too, were shipped and sold in America. And I'd never heard of this. I'd never heard of the details. And while this only told a bit of the story, it disturbed me and encouraged me and horrified me. So I thought, great story here. And Don and I had been talking about how do we how do we sell a story about the abolition of slavery? We've been talking about it and we hadn't come up with anything. I came back to England with the photocopy of this book, and he will tell you what happened then.
Well, I suppose that I'm laurel to Mike's Hardy, in that it was another fine mess he got me into. In that I read the photocopies of what he had brought back, and what he'd brought back was photocopies of a book written by a man called Abbott Emerson Smith, who had written about how women, mainly prostitutes, but all sorts of other people as well, who were taken out of the Bridewell prison in London in the early 1600s and sent off to the new colonies in America as brides for the planters, if you like. So these were women of marriageable age or of breeding age or whatever, who would be sent off, because up until then, of course, you had a brand new colony, it was all men, and for this to become viable, they needed women. And this seemed to be an astonishing thing, and so it went from there, and one looked at this and thought, well, this is just the tip of something. This is actually the edge of something here. And so the very fact that these women were taken out of the penal system in Britain, in England, and sent off to the new colonies with no say for themselves about whether or not they went or not. So the interesting thing was, what was it they were going into? What was it was already there that these people could just be taken out and shipped 3,000 miles away? And so we started to look at what this possibly could mean and what the wider context was of that. And that's how it began.
And we unearthed a wider and wider story. We found it wasn't just women, it was children, it was convicts, it was prisoners of war, it was all sorts. It was also people who signed up as indentured servants to get to America free of, they didn't have to pay the passage, the poor. They would be contracted, indentured by merchants and by captains and by planters' agents to go to America free, in return for which they gave up their rights to their labour for several years. It was supposed to be, according to history, it's 4 or 5 years. In fact, it could be as many as 12. And what they didn't realise was that they were signing away all their rights, and they had become chattels. They were used as property, regarded as property. Now, as we began to investigate this, and we used all the kind of resources that investigators do. We look at every kind of book, every kind of official report, etc., diaries, letters. We realised it was an enormous story, and it was also something which refuted one of the great ideas of, well, one of the key ideas of the development of slavery, which is that in 1619 slavery began in America with the arrival of 20 and odd Negroes, as they were called, sold, according to accounts, by a Dutch captain to planters in England, and this was where slavery began. Well, it wasn't true. Slavery had begun earlier. Children and women and convicts had been sold earlier than that, and although a small number of Africans were subsequently brought to Virginia and sold over the next decades, only very few, only 350 years later. Oh, sorry, 20 years later. But meantime, hundreds, thousands of poor whites were being brought in, and on various convicts and children, etc., and they were being enslaved. So that started us thinking this is an enormous story. It was a story too big, in fact, to sell to television. There were so many aspects of it, we didn't know how to compact it. But we did think it was an important and terrific book.
Yeah. And then the question was, if we were right on what was going on, the question in your mind immediately is, as a journalist, is, well, why doesn't everybody know this already? Or have we just got the wrong end of the stick here? And that is, of course, everybody's fear. I mean, it's the fear if you're doing something contemporary, just as it is if you're doing something that's historical. That the famous kind of thing was, that I remember when we worked in World in Action, was there would be the person who would turn up with 3 briefcases full of documents. And your first thing in your mind was, is this person a crank, or are they real? They've got a bee on their bonnet, they feel aggrieved, something terrible as far as they're concerned has happened in their lives. The question in your mind is, am I on the edge of a great story here, or is this another one of the astonishing numbers of cranks of the kind of a green and red ink brigade, yet again turning up with 1,000 documents to prove something which is totally and utterly mad and is just a bee in their bonnet? So, of course, we were immediately worried about that as well. But we noticed certain patterns that, as we started to look at this, that appeared. One of which was that when you looked at these early people who were sent out, like Mike just talked about, children were sent out, street children were rounded up and sent off. And when you read about the official versions as to why this was happening in the very early 17th century, the official versions were always that this was a great humanitarian thing, that they were taking these poor urchins off the street and sending them off to start a new life in these fabulous new colonies, where instead of having a dead-end life where they die on the streets of malnutrition and illness, they would be given a new chance. Well, if that were true, it suddenly occurred to us, we would surely know that, because that would be one of the greatest humanitarian things that's ever happened in the history of the world. So why was it that that's the way it was painted up at the time, which it was? Even John Donne, the famous poet, who was the Dean of St. Paul's, actually gave sermons from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral about how this is a wonderful humanitarian thing, that these kids who have been sent off for this fresh chance. Now, if that was true, why isn't it something, you'd know that at school, you'd be taught about it. But interestingly, it's something which at the time was made a big deal of, but not now. It's not on any syllabus. So there was obviously something odd about this.
Well, it's still perpetuated. You find that some history books still talk glowingly about how starving kids were sent to America and apprenticed. You can find it where it happened at Bridewell, St. Bride's Church. I believe there is a commemoration of the apprentices who were saved and sent to America. Well, we looked at the documents, as you should. We looked at every document. I'm sure historians must have done, but they missed a lot, because those documents showed that these children were picked up and how they were going to be sold, and what they were going to be priced for, and what rights they didn't have. In fact, the company gave to itself all rights over these children. It pretended to anxious parents, there were some, that no, they would be given apprenticeships, they'd get land in the end. Nonsense. Most of them were dead within a year anyway, but this is still perpetuated. Sorry, I interrupted there.
Quite right.
But thank God there are loads and loads of documents from the 17th and 18th centuries, and amazingly, and to be blunt, to look at, to say, well, why hasn't that appeared? Why hasn't that been used? And you can test, as a journalist should, assumptions against these documents, and you can find that many assumptions are wrong. So perhaps some of ours are, but certainly a lot of the general historians' assumptions are bloody wrong.
And that was really our starting point, was to see why these assumptions had grown up, and why it was that what we were seeing in the contemporary documentation seemed to show a completely, if you like, a parallel universe. There's the official story, and there's the unofficial or perhaps true story, and we see huge parallels today in so many things, and it shows that spin was alive and well in the 17th century, just like it is now. You have the official story about what's happening, and then you have the hidden or covert story about what is really going on. And that's what we find that we were actually going after here.
Let me quote you from that great man, Thomas Jefferson. He was worried about the idea that convicts, lots of convicts had been sent to America, and God forbid, some Americans have been descended from convicts. He wrote this: "The malefactors sent to America were not sufficient in number to merit enumeration as one class. I do not think that the whole number sent would amount to 2,000, and being principally men eaten up with disease, they married seldom and propagated little. I do not suppose that themselves and their descendants are at present 4,000, which is little more than 1,000th part of the whole inhabitants." At that time, 1,000 convicts a year were being sent to America. According to unimpeachable sources, if you can believe convict traders, in Maryland alone, 600 a year had been going for 60 years. Tens of thousands of convicts have been flooding America, but does America want to know? No, it doesn't. And it hasn't ever since. You've got all kinds of self-delusions. I mean, you've got ideas about why America was so preoccupied in preventing the truth from coming out.
Well, I think that because of being an emergent nation, it was necessary to have a kind of creation myth, really. And I think that they were able to create one, really. I think that there's a very different thing if you look at what happened in Australia, whereas Australia and New South Wales in Botany Bay was set up as deliberately, they were designated penal colonies. And so anybody who went there, actually, and who's descended from it, they know they're descended from convicts. And actually in Australia it's worn as a kind of badge of honour, because actually quite a lot of these convicts were, of course, just petty thieves and so on, and horse thieves and general ne'er-do-wells and riffraff.
And political dissidents.
But that's the point, exactly, because quite a lot of them were, of course, were political dissidents. And so, of course, particularly, you know, Irish nationalists and so on, who were rounded up and sent there in large numbers. And, of course, for them, the fact that they'd been transported for their political views, of course, was like a badge of honour. But in America, it was much more amorphous. This is a much more heterogeneous thing. And it happened in a totally different way, that none of these new plantations, even though they were all about making money, it wasn't about getting rid of undesirables, although that was a large part of it. It was a money-making machine. And so what one had to do was to actually organize it. And there were so many different groups of people, of political dissidents, religious dissidents, political refugees, and all sorts of people, and people who went of their own free will and then found themselves caught up basically in labor camps and so on, that it was so much more amorphous. And out of it was born an idea of freedom, even at the time when the vast majority of workers, of the workforce in America, were actually used as a slave labor force. But yet Americans themselves, that as it went on, they wanted to create a sense of this being separate from and different from the yoke of Britain, the English colonial system. And so a whole new view was plastered over the top of what was going on in a way in which it couldn't have been done in Australia.
One of the keys, one of the problems from our point of view, of course, was how do you understand the relationship between black slavery and white slavery? And we're still grappling with that. You have to read the book to see how. But one begat the other, as some black historians now agree, that the basis, the structures of black slavery, enslavement, were built first around whites. In fact, white and black for decade after decade lived and worked and died and struggled and ran away together. This is something which could not be afforded by the plantation class, by the big planters. And after a big rebellion in the 1670s, they, I think, a deliberate policy of divide and rule developed. And thereafter, white servants were told that they weren't really the same as black servants. Blacks were slaves and whites were servants. In fact, the black position was worsened considerably, horribly. The white position wasn't worsened, but it was supposedly improved, but it was only marginally. They were still chattels, they were still used, and this was, and they could still be bought and sold. You can see it in wills, which will the planter's possessions to his sons, etc., and they may include 10 Negro slaves, 10 white servants, etc., etc., along with the horses and the chattels, etc. This went on all the way through the British colonial period. It ended with the War of Independence, and a couple of days into the War of Independence, there was an advert in the Virginia Gazette, and we found this by trawling through the Virginia Gazette. It was an advert, well, many adverts for runaways. This is one of the great insights into black slavery, black enslavement, the number of runaway notices saying his name is whatever, he looks like this, he's got marks of whipping on his back, there's £5 reward if you return to the master, etc. Well, many of these went out for white servants as well. On this day in April 1770, 77, I'm not quite sure which it was, 1775, which was a couple of days after the first fighting began, which launched the American War of Independence. 10 ads appeared in the Virginia Gazette for runaways. 2 were for black runaways, 8 were for white runaways. 2 of those notices for white runaways were put in by a planter called George Washington. And he was still looking for them after the war.
Amazing, yeah.
The one great thing about investigating history, which marks it out from investigating contemporary events, is that you don't have to worry about libel.
But I suppose to explain, I mean, one thing that we haven't said, for those of you who don't know, the basis of how the early American successful colonies worked was it was through the Virginia Company, which was one of these brand new things called a joint stock company. And this was the creation of modern capitalism, modern mercantile capitalism as we know it today. And up until then, up until this period, basically merchants basically worked independently or in loose ad hoc collections of people to fund great enterprises and so on. And the idea was of actually coming together in a more formal way and creating these joint stock companies. And the Virginia Company was just one of these new joint stock companies. And they were given the right to actually to people a part of this of the new world. And to do so, they had various big problems. One, of course, was distance, because it was 3,000 miles away. Another one was that in Elizabethan times, they had hoped and had been told that they would find untold wealth in the form of gold and silver, like the Spanish and Portuguese had done further south. And initially, they hoped that they would get rich quick on this fantastic scheme of just going there and basically finding gold. And all sorts of totally erroneous reports were brought back by various early adventurers about great quantities of gold. And they had this vision of El Dorado in the north. Now, very quickly, when one barrel supposedly of gold was brought back during the days of Walter Raleigh, and when it was actually analysed and assayed, of course, it was fool's gold. That dreadful thing that we all know from cowboy westerns and so on, and gold rush movies and so on. We all know that. And this had happened then, and so they realised that if they were going to make this work, it was going to have to be through finding cash crops that would work, and that they'd have to really run plantations. And to do that, to make it work, they needed a huge supply of labor, and they needed it preferably to be cheap labor, or even better, free labor. And so that was how basically the idea of getting people to come, either of rounding up people out of the jails and prisons and so on, or sweeping kids off the street, or also, of course, that the great social benefit was that if you would get rid of all the vagabonds and various sort of lowlife that people didn't like. And of course, vagabonds were not just people without a trade, because a vagabond in the late 1500s, early 1600s, was classed as anybody who was like, if you were a traveling minstrel, you were classed as a vagabond. So Shakespeare, in fact, would have been a vagabond at one time, because he was a member of a group of traveling players. Fortunately, he had very rich allies and patrons. And in fact, the interesting thing was that Shakespeare became an investor in the Virginia Company, along with his famous patron, the Earl of Southampton. So they needed this cheap labor force, and the question was how to get it. And they dressed up these ideas of rounding up basically vagrants, petty criminals, and then, of course, all sorts of dissidents and so on. And they would all be shipped off under the pretense that basically they were the ones who were not criminals and who were not criminalized in this system of rounding up vagrants and homeless children and so on. They used a very interesting technique to actually to persuade people to go there. They painted a rosy picture of this great new world. And they were aided and abetted in this by a wonderful thing, because at that time, of course, there was a huge upsurge in religious dissent, and all sorts of new religious groups grew up, with names that we know today, like the Quakers and the Puritans and the Plymouth Brethren and so on. And there was this great millennialism, this idea of finding the new world, and so lots of people wanted to go to find a new world. If only you could cleanse yourself of the horrors and the tainted world that they find themselves in today. And so, of course, they were ripe for the plucking. And the idea was that if they had no money, many of them, and so all they were doing was going to work their passage off over a period of years. But of course, this system was totally abused, and it was totally abused in a very particular way, which maybe Mike would like to talk about, called the headright system, which is how human beings became commoditized. They were turned into commodities, like chattels, like something that could be bought and sold, like a hog or a cow or a goat or anything else. And they became worth a particular amount of money. And this was simply because, and how they turned in from people who were just going to search a new life for themselves, became commodities. And maybe you'd like to talk about that, Mike.
Well, headrights was introduced in 1619 to encourage settlement. And the idea was the payment of 50 acres of land in Virginia for every soul brought into Virginia, every soul brought in by someone else, or every soul who paid for their own passage. And so people, after with money, could invest in people. They could pay for half a dozen poor to go to America. They would sign them up as indentured servants, and if it was half a dozen, they'd get half a dozen and 50 acres, a couple of hundred, several hundred acres. Some brought vast numbers of people, 60, 70, hundreds. I think I can't remember how, but there was certainly something like 80 groups who brought, or 80 individuals who brought in more than 100 people each during a couple of years. And they got vast amounts of land. They also got the labour of these people who signed up to get there. They had the labour of these people for a number of years. It varied between 3 and 11 years. But if the system developed that these people who were claimed to be the riches of Virginia, planters would say later on, our riches are our servants. They were indeed. They would get these people, they would make money on them by getting more and more acres, which they could sell. The servants themselves, if they disobeyed, if they ran away, their period of servitude would be doubled. Sometimes it would certainly go up. It could go up. For every month away, they could serve 10 extra months. So if you're away for a few months, you could serve years and years and years. But most of these people never survived that long anyway. Half of them died within a year. They, as Don said, they became a trade developed. It became very, very profitable to deal in men. And there were all kinds of, and women, all kinds, and children, all kinds of agents were doing this. And in fact, this so needful was Virginia and Maryland and the rest of America for labour that another market, a criminal market, grew up, which Don can talk about.
Well, well, a good sign of people realizing they're on a good thing is that as soon as a market develops, you can be sure that that criminals latch onto it, and this is something that one sees throughout history. And the interesting thing is that right at the very beginning, I mean, almost immediately, the first children were rounded up and sent out to work on the plantations in the brave new world. Almost immediately, a kidnapping industry grew up, and of course, a kidnapping industry could only grow up if there was a demand, and there was, because these new plantations, not only in America but also in the Caribbean, to service the new plantations throughout the Caribbean as well. They were a voracious demand for labour, simply because the attrition rate was horrendous. People either were worked to death because since they were only signed up for a specific number of years, anything, you know, to 4, 5, 6, 7 years, or even longer in some cases. If you were a young child, if you were a boy, and some of them were only aged 7 or 8 years old, and you were swept up and taken away, you belonged to your new master until the age of 21. So a long time. And so the criminal underworld realized very quickly there was a market here to service this. And of course, they weren't constrained by any of the needs and desires of the official world. So they started to round up kids off the streets of the seaports of the British Isles, and they had a wonderful name. They were called spirits because they spirited people away. And the spirits, the first recorded spirit was in 1618 in the West Country. And which is very early, if you think it's right at the very beginning of this whole enterprise. And very quickly it became the first really big-scale organised crime syndicates, really, is what grew up then, which I think is something which isn't realised, that the idea of organised crime syndicates we think as being something entirely new. It isn't. It's something that existed in the early 1700s. And they were able to exist like crime syndicates do all over the world with the connivance of the authorities. And they had all sorts of people from local beadles and constables and magistrates, and all sorts of people were in cahoots with them to round people up and flog them off to go and work as slave labour in the colonies. So this is one of the fascinating things, and very quickly you see how this, and it became a huge cause célèbre. When you read the newspapers, the news sheets of the flyers of the 1600s, you see that it became one of these sort of, you know, like urban myths. I mean, it was a shocking thing, and there were endless reports about about how, and in fact there were cases where people got so worried about being spirited away that in fact there were cases where in the West Country in England where word was get around that spirits were in the distance, and all the young women or men of the village or town they would actually run away.
They hid in the forest or the
Yeah.
There was a parallel with paedophilia, you know, with the fear of paedophilia today.
Yeah. Except this was in a huge level, and of course went on for a long time. And then, of course, laws were quickly passed against all of this. And the kind of people who were preyed upon were the gullible, the weak, the young. So it was young children right through into men and women in their early mid-20s, really, and these people were either just shanghaied, like you think of straightforward violent kidnapping, or they could be inveigled on board ships. Come and see around my ship. And the next thing they know is the ship has taken sail and they're on it. And that happened a great deal. And in fact, stories like that were the basis for a great deal of stories that you get in literature. If you look at Robert Louis Stevenson's famous book, Kidnapped, the story about how Davy Balfour, the hero of Kidnap, is inveigled on board this bark at anchor just to come and see around it, and the way this young boy is. And the next thing he knows is the ship sets sail and they're bound for Carolina. And that was, and like so many things that writers use, of course, this is based on absolute fact. And there were so many cases of this happening to people, and people were, they were, plied with alcohol, spirited away. They were knocked over the head. They were persuaded that they were signing up for, for a great world where they'd be given land and all the rest, and of course, and just duped into this. And sometimes it was much more violent.
They used to get, I think, a man who rang the biggest gang of conspirators in London worked from St Paul's, and he got, I think it was 40 shillings per head from the American agent for everyone he picked up. And his followers would gather around him in St Paul's, and they'd be told, right, what we need today is a 6'2" fellow who knows about farming. So they'd go and look, etc., bring him back, get 40 shillings, and this. Apparently this guy allegedly handled about 700 or 800 a year, according to another estimate by, which we don't believe, nobody believes, but it must show something. And this was by an anti-slaver, a cleric. He reckoned that in 1680, the numbers being spirited away were 10,000 a year. I can't believe that, but I'm sure that it was a huge number. Nobody can know, of course, how many were spirited away. How can you bloody well tell?
No crime statistics in the 17th century.
One of the great things about the Virginia Company being a company, for us investigative journalists, is that of course it kept minutes. It kept voluminous records, and in those records, and it still escapes me how many historians haven't read them, you've got the details of the fiddles, of the governors who were selling people on their own account, the governors in Virginia. You've got details of how a man who was running the Virginia Company, a man who was still hailed as a great defender of democracy, because he took on James I, and he also introduced an assembly in Virginia. This man is called Edwin Sandys, is lauded, but it was Edwin Sandys behind the capture and sale of children. It was Edwin Sandys who, when James I wanted 100 youths who he didn't like, who had been making a nuisance of themselves around one of his palaces, when he wanted them deported and forced the Virginia Company to do so, it was Edwin Sandys who said, "Oh, I'll take some of them on my plantation." You get this from the minutes. You get amazing stuff about people who historians say are terrific, and they're not.
And one of the fascinating things about that is to see why, when we just said, that this actually became systematized and actually part of how the colonies were actually peopled and how labor was collected, was that, just like Mike quoted sources on the American side, in England you see all sorts of memoirs and private letters and so on, and you learn that, for example, by 1647, 1649, a man called William Bullock, who had settled in Virginia and also in Barbados, he wrote a book about the new colony of Virginia and what it was like. And he actually said in the book that actually the normal way of getting labor was actually you went to the spirits. And then we read also letters from a plantation owner later on in the 1660s in Barbados. He comes to England to buy servants from the spirits. And he laments the fact that, in fact, that somebody else, that in fact that the market has dried up temporarily, and he's incredibly miffed. And so you see, actually, that there is a pattern here, and that it's an accepted way of actually buying your labour force, and that the criminality became, and we also know that it was sanctioned officially. How do we know that? Well, we know that because there were various laws passed about kidnapping, specifically to outlaw kidnapping people for the new colonies. And the first one was passed in 1645. It made no difference. Various edicts and laws were taken that all ships that were leaving for the colonies had to be searched to see were there any children on board who were not there of their own free will or without a letter of permission from their parents or guardians. This, of course, was not enforced. It was for a little bit in Bristol, which was the only port that took it seriously. And then again in 1670, another law was passed that actually said that kidnapping children to send them to new colonies was a capital offence, punishable by hanging. And we can see how effective that was simply because you see what actually happened when spirits came up before the courts, when they actually came to trial. One great example in the mid-1600s was two kidnappers, husband and wife, came up before the court in London for kidnapping and sending off, without her parents' permission, a 16-year-old girl. So it's now it's been a capital offence for 12 years at this stage. This is 1682, I think it is. And so what great penalty is meted out to them? They were fined 14 pence. They would have got anything up to £20, by the way, for selling that girl, by the way, and they were fined 14 pence. So what you see is the courts not meting out the penalties and the whole thing actually being part of a whole system throughout the society at that time.
Oddly, it's one of the villains of history is a hero in this. One of the great villains of history is Judge Jeffreys, the bloody assize, the man who executed hundreds after the rebellion against James II by the Duke of Monmouth. The bloody assize swept through the West Country. As he was sweeping through the West Country, he heard, Judge Jeffreys, that the mayor of Bristol and the rest of the magistrates there were in cahoots with the spiriters, and they were conning people into pleading guilty to crimes which would get them transported. And if they didn't plead guilty, said the local judges to these malefactors, you're going to hang. And of course they all pleaded guilty. They were sent off there and they were sold, and the locals made a lot of money. Judge Jeffreys heard about this. He was outraged, amazingly. He brought the mayor into court and said he was going to have him. He was going to do terrible things to him. He began by fining him £1,000, which is a hell of a lot of money then. But then he was going to do much more. Alas, Judge Jeffreys fell, and James II fell. That's a Catholic, I say, alas. Fell a few months later, and he was never able to right this wrong. And so the good Bristol Protestants went on taking we Catholics away.
Was there a way in which they determined the value of convicts and slaves?
Well, it was laid down when in 1718. The government decided it wanted to make it a bigger business, sending convicts out to America, and so it subsidised them. And it said, well, we will pay every trader so much money per head. And the money paid, originally a trader put in a very small bid, well, a very healthy bid, £3 a head. He upped it to £6 later on. He wanted to get the trade. He got it all. So he got £6 a head. Is that the price? No, because it's what he could get for it in the States. Sorry, in America. No, it wasn't laid down, but that ensured he got that £6 and he'd make a profit, whoever he took there. And they would normally sell children for £7 or £8, women for about £9, and skilled people for anything from £15 upwards. Though we found in what is an amazing resource, if everybody wants to look at what was happening in the over a 200 or 300 year period, look at the website of the Old Bailey. It's amazing. It's got all the transcripts, transcript after transcript of trials. It's astonishing stuff. And in this, one of the end of our story is a plot to continue sending convicts to America. America has got independence. The English don't know what to do with their convicts because they can't send them to America anymore. So they've got 1,000 convicts a year. They've built up a great well of convicts on ships in hulks in the Thames, and they're filthy and they're full of disease and people are breaking out of them, etc. What can we do? Says the English king and the English administration. Well, smuggle them into America. So they decide they're going to smuggle them into America. They're going to con the Americans into believing these convicts are really ordinary poor immigrants. Well, they think they can get rid of it. And it goes ahead, this story. And it's in investigating this story, of course it doesn't succeed in the end, as Chipman gets through. In investigating this, we found one guy who'd been sent, one convict, to America in this shipment. He'd been sold, and he by a whole series of mishaps, had returned to England and was going to be hanged because it was a capital offence to come back from transportation before your time. So this guy was going to be hanged. He told his story in court, and it's in the transcripts, and he said that he was sold for £60, which was a fortune. Anyway.
What was his skill?
I don't know. He didn't tell what his skill was. He just said, "I'm sorry, I
that's
just
a very
want to
good
come
point,
back."
because the price not only depended on how much did it cost to actually send the person, and that remained more or less steady around about £6 or so by the time you gave somebody a few grits to eat and you kept them and looked after them and put them on the ship and paid the passage to get them there. So that was about £6, and then you looked for your profit on top of that, and very soon the price then rose once they had crossed the Atlantic to about sort of £20 or so. And so, in fact, it's a very good question, is that the price, because the price actually then tells you an awful lot about also how there was a con in all of this. There's a widespread view that basically by people who decided to sign up as indentured servants of their own volition and then basically worked for plantation owners or factory owners in the colonies, that this was just a straightforward financial transaction. And basically, you pay for me, I haven't got any money, you pay for me to go across the Atlantic, and then I work for you for X number of years to pay off the passage. But when you look at the economics of it, you see that this is actually not really the case at all. And we're able to work that out because of some fantastic contemporary documents. One in particular is a remarkable piece of work by a man called Richard Ligon. And Ligon was a royalist in England, and during the civil wars he'd backed the wrong side, obviously, and he lost his lands and his money, and he decided that he'd go to Barbados and chance his luck at setting up. And because when he went there, he was very well received by all the major landowners and planters and so on, and was received at the finest houses of the greatest planters of the day, who were already making astonishing amounts of money. And Ligon did the remarkable thing. He then came back to England, and he wrote his account of this trip, a true and accurate account of the island of Barbados, or something it's called, published in 1659. And this book is one of the world's first business self-help manuals. Today, if you go into any shop, any bookshop, they're absolutely just stuffed in the business department of how to do it. You know, how to be a tycoon, how to become a billionaire, etc., etc., etc. Well, Ligon wrote one of the first books of this in the middle of the 1600s, and he described not only his incredible adventures about going to Barbados and coming back again, but he also described what you had to do to set up as a sugar planter, and he described in minute detail all the costs, from how much it cost to buy your farm, etc., right through to all your labor costs and everything else. And at the time he wrote, of course, conditions in Barbados were truly horrendous. If they were bad in Virginia, they were a lot worse, because there was no attempt, like in America, not only the Virginia company saw it all as a money-making exploit, that's what it was, pure and simple, but also there was a feeling about this idea of this new idea of colonies and empire, and the idea of empire was really taking root there. But in the islands where they had the sugar farms and the sugar factories, it was basically just slave labor. What it was all about there was purely making money as fast as you could, and nobody cared about the attrition rate of the labour force or anything like that at all. So when Ligon described all of this, he went through minute detail of how much it cost, you see, to run your sugar plantation, including the costs of buying your workforce, and also because of the figures he had of the annual gross and net profit levels that he worked out from his conversations with these grandees, like people like James Drax, one of the richest men at that time in the world, because of his sugar plantations. And he worked this out, and from that you see that if somebody, because they wanted to start a brave new world, life in a brave new world, and for the want of £6 for their passage, because an agricultural labourer's wage at that time in Britain was about 12, 15 pounds an annum, so no way could they have that. If you're a skilled labourer, you could earn 20, 25, 30 pounds a year, depending on what you did and where you lived. So it was also very difficult for people to raise that money. So, so they would obviously sign up for an indenture, and it was for 5 years minimum. Now, according to Ligon's amazing figures, the profit that each labourer made for their employer was, believe it or not, you paid off your £6 in 38 days. Sounds impossible, but true. Within a year, each labourer made for their master just under £58 profit per annum. So this idea that they then had to work for maybe 5, 6, 7 years or longer, of course, is preposterous. Because, of course, it wasn't just a straightforward economic contract. And, of course, these people, of course, had no way of working this out for themselves. So they were being conned here. And that's really what was happening with the indentured services. They were conned as to all these numbers of years that they had to work to pay off this passage. In fact, they paid it off incredibly quickly.
And once you were there, that was it. You couldn't get out. There's one source which is terrific. It's called Thomas Burton's Parliamentary Diary, and it covered the Cromwellian period. When the Stuarts came back to power, they tried to get rid of all the records of the Cromwellian period, all the parliamentary records. But Thomas Burton's diary survives, and it's somewhere in the British Library. And it describes how in 1653, a group of 70 or 80 cavaliers, suspected cavaliers, were shipped out and sold in Barbados. And they were probably, some of them were certainly innocent. They weren't involved in an uprising, but the local Roundheads wanted to get rid of them and make money, because two of Cromwell's closest aides in the House of Commons, Puritans, they organised this trade. They made money out of the trade, and two of these chaps who'd been sold, they managed to get back to England. They escaped, and they arrived in Parliament with a petition. This is at a time when England was still riven with fury over between Roundheads and Cavaliers, and you can tell from the diary how the hatred which still persisted. But even so, the Puritan MPs were outraged, some of them, at what they learned their colleagues had been doing, selling freeborn Englishmen like that, and they roared and they raved, but it was suppressed. One of the guys who took the lead in demanding action had been a signatory to the execution of Charles I. A couple of years later, and he demanded action. He demanded these cavaliers who he hated be freed. They weren't. And a couple of years later, Cromwell died, and then a couple of years after that, the Stuarts were restored. The man who demanded the freedom of these Puritan prisoners, he was executed because he'd signed the death warrant of Charles I. As for the Cavaliers, they were left in Barbados for years because a genuine sale had taken place, and their owners wouldn't let them come back to England. I don't know, just... Okay. So that's helplessness, if you like.
Are you guys ready for some questions? We can open the floor for questions. I'd be grateful if you could wait for a microphone to come to you. And we'll ask our questions of Jordan and Mike Walsh. Go ahead. Yeah.
I've got two questions. The first relates to this legal code in operation in Jamestown in the early days, which you say would be the envy of the Taliban, and people could be executed for not going to church. As far as I know, I may be wrong, but I don't think people were being executed in England at that time. for not going to church. Could you comment on that? And would you like the second question now or afterwards?
I think the first one's destroyed me, but okay, the first question, I don't believe people were being executed in England for not going to church, and Dale's Law, which is what Dale's Code, which is what you're referring to, it was indeed the most ferocious set of laws that, and a set of laws that England certainly didn't operate in England. Did I understand your question correctly?
I think so. And these people were presumably Protestants.
Yes, they all would have been Protestants indeed. I mean, you were executed as a Catholic priest, but you weren't. No non-Protestants were allowed in Virginia at the time.
Okay, second question. I'm very interested in the nature of the research that you did for this book, because I've been doing similar research over the past 3 years in relation to 2 Caribbean colonies. I haven't read the whole of the book yet, but I get the impression that the vast majority of the references in your notes are to published books, printed books, some of which were contemporary, but some of which were much later. And where you do use stuff at the National Archives at Kew, often you refer to the Calendar of State Papers, which are printed summaries written by a civil servant and expurgated in some cases, rather than the original documents. And there must be a vast quantity of original documents in terms of correspondence from the colonies to the lords of trade and plantations, and you don't seem, I get the impression, used very much of this material.
No, it's true. We didn't, alas, spend as much time as we would have liked at Kew. I mean, we could and would, if we'd have had the opportunity, have spent another year researching this. Alas, we couldn't. Our publisher wouldn't allow us to do that. And our publisher also said 100,000 words. We wanted to write twice as much, because we certainly had enough material, but we didn't have enough time alas, it's no good excuse, but I'm afraid that's the truth. We didn't have enough time to go to sources we wanted to.
Right over there.
Now, do we know what happened to some of the indentured servants after they finished their period? Did any of them ever get what they thought they were going to get in the end? Are there any, I hesitate to call them success stories, but are there any stories of people who did, work it through and eventually get a small parcel of land or something?
Well, there were indeed. In fact, there were some notable cases of this. That, in fact, some notable families are descended from these early workers. Jimmy Carter's family, for example, and so some did. But one has to say that they are the minority. Even those who survived their indenture period, and one's looking at very severe working conditions. Even those who survived were quite often conned out of the things that were promised to them. You see, people were promised as part of the sweetener, because there was a huge advertising campaign went on in England to get people to go. And they were promised what were called freedom dues. And this could be anything from a sum of money to a plot of land to some livestock and a bag of meal or whatever to set you up as a farmer. Right? But quite often when they had finished their period, that they discovered that somehow or other the freedom dues had evaporated. Right? And also sometimes actually it was even worse than that, because if you take Barbados, for example, people were promised, of course, that they could get their plot of land in Barbados. The only thing is that by the mid-1600s, the large plantation owners had bought up every last single scrap of land that you could plant anything on in Barbados. So when the worker finally got their freedom, they were forced they had 2 options. One, if they had any money, which they usually didn't, of course, they could pay for a passage to another island and try to start again somewhere else, or they would have to sell their labor back to the very people who they'd been working for as free slave labor for all those years. And of course, because of the nature of the control of the labor market, of course, at a hugely reduced and depressed price, of course. So, in fact, even for those who survived, things were not really that good. Some did do well, however, and there are some astonishing cases of people who went on. And in fact, there are remarkable cases of people who went on and actually became planters. And actually then their own indentured servants had their own slave labor force. And there are famous cases of that as well.
Including black cases.
The women you began, who were taken out, did they end up being prostitutes there, or
Well, they married.
People who turned out to be black slave owners.
They did marry, yeah. A lot of them did.
We haven't been able to trace many. One we traced was I think the third girl to be picked up in 1618, Elizabeth Abbott. She was shipped out, and we believe she was sold in the spring of 1619, and pick her up 4 years later. Most of the first 300 children died within a very short period. I think only 12 reached the. We're not sure, but the indications are only a dozen ever reached adulthood. There may have been more than that, but that's certainly one assertion, and I believe it. And Elizabeth Abbott was one of the few who did survive. And we find her in 1624, murdered. She had become a servant to a planter whose wife, this planter's wife, was a heroine. In the Indian War, this woman had done the Western thing. She'd held out against she was terrific against the Indian horde. She'd refused to budge, etc. And she was lionized for this. But a couple of years later, she and her husband are accused of killing this girl. So this is, I don't know why I mentioned that, but you can't trace many people, and this is one that we did trace.
Anybody? Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Hold on a second. Wait for the mic. There you go.
Hi, I'm one of those people who has lots of questions, but I'll try and restrain myself. The first question I had was that you seem to be quoting a lot of sources from the Virginia colony, and I was wondering whether you also have comments to make about sort of all of the colonies, whether what's going on in Virginia is happening elsewhere as well. And then my second question is just about the historical context of this, because you're talking about people who led as Hobbes would have said, their lives were nasty, brutish, and short, but weren't lives in 17th and 18th century England pretty nasty, brutish, and short as well? And so, what kind of concept of civil rights would people have had at the time? I mean, for example, the area that I know about in New England, women couldn't own land. Women were not citizens in the way that they would have been they were in New France. So there's a lot of sort of complexity and differences between, this vast area of land that's been colonized, but a lot of differences even in this period that you're looking at.
Well, this argument has been made in defence of the indentured system, that it was no worse, it's been claimed, than in England. Well, this is just not true. In England, well, we don't believe it's true. In England, you could only be signed up for a year. In England, you weren't property, you weren't chattels, you weren't, you might be beaten, and servants were being beaten and so were wives up until very recently, but you weren't beaten to death. And if you were, it's very unlikely that your beater will get away with it. It did continually in America. You weren't tied to a whipping post. If you fled, you weren't branded, you weren't manacled. You weren't, in other words, treated as we know that Africans were, and whites were treated as Africans were. I must emphasise that the very worst treatment was meted out to Africans later on. You could be limbed if you were an African and you fled. In other words, lose a limb. Nothing like that, I believe, happened to whites, but it was pretty damned awful what did happen to whites. So, as for lessons, or as for what was happening in other parts of the 13 colonies, it varied. Maryland, Pennsylvania, terrible things happened. In New England, terrible things happened, which we've detailed some of them. But I think the extremes, the worst extremes, were in Maryland and Virginia. This is where we concentrate. There's a lot of work we'd like to have done in other parts of the colonies, but and we have done some. But much the same attitude to the use of servants as property, that prevailed almost throughout the 13 colonies.
So is that due to the lack of a sort of...
Hold on a second.
Sorry.
You need the mic.
No, it was just a comment. I was just wondering about the policing system, because you're making a comparison between what happens in England. There's a legal system which is enforced. Presumably there's also a legal system in the 13 colonies. But you're saying that people can get away with it.
Well, you're on the edge of on the edge of civilization, as it was called, and you are less, it's more easy to get away with things. But also there was a different attitude. A very telling moment was in the mid-17th century when the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a resolution warning planters, and they were all planters themselves, that the vicious means they were using to suppress and control their servants were deterring immigrants from coming, and they better stop. They didn't stop. The very fact that it could be announced, it could be people could be encouraged to obey the law, if you like. It made no difference, because the law was also controlled by the planters themselves, and they would be very kind to their fellows.
And it was a matter of degree. What happened out on the edge of the known universe, if you like, was very different from what you could get away with at the centre. And out on the periphery, they decided to codify their laws about the relationship between masters and servants, and in various ways. And particularly in Barbados in the 1660s, they set up a code. And this code was something that could never have happened in Europe. You couldn't have had this in England. And it codified, for example, throughout all of this period, there was a huge problem of servants always running away. This is an ongoing problem. Now, if things were really good, you wouldn't have had this endless ongoing problem right throughout the 17th century into the 1800s of servants running away and whites and blacks running away together. And so anyway, they decided to have a code in Barbados which shows the level of how this was different from what you had in Europe. And if you ran away, it was decided, if you ran off the plantation, for every 2 days you were absent without leave, if you like, because they had a pass system, which is reminiscent of some other things in history we could think of. And they had a pass system, and if you were absent without leave, as it were, for 2 days, that was 1 extra year's servitude. If a male servant married without permission, 4 years extra servitude. If a servant fathered a child without their permission of their master, 3 years extra servitude. Now, this did not happen with farm workers at home back in England. This is totally different. The whole scale of the way in which they were treated, as well as Mike said, brandings, manaclings, whippings, people had bodkins put through their tongue. All sorts of terrible things were done to people that would not have been done
legally.
Yeah, and so it was very different. Out there, the gloves were off. At home, there was still the idea, thanks to the Magna Carta and so on, there's still the idea of the free-born Englishman. But of course, and also you have to remember, a great number of these workers were people who were looked upon with huge disdain and contempt, because they were quite often Irish, and of course the Irish Catholics, their masters were almost entirely, of course, were English Puritans, and of course so they were not only foreigners, but they were also religious enemies, and they were a very long way from home, and also they were part of another system that was going on, which was actually to clear clearances in Ireland to push the Irish out so as the plantation could happen. So for economic and political reasons and religious reasons, they were very badly treated.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering to what extent you thought that the situation of English people being used for servitude had a lot to do with the expropriation of the commons throughout English history.
Absolutely, it's a direct correlation. The enclosures, the loss of land, the pauperization of the English had a direct relationship to the dispatch of what was called the surplus poor into America. Indeed, all the way back to the 16th century, this was being argued. The people behind Raleigh, or rather, people not behind Raleigh, the people with Raleigh, were arguing this. Hakluyt, the great geographer, he argued that because we were being England was being, he claimed, overrun by the poor. And why were they being overrun? They're being overrun, if they were being overrun, because the poor were dispossessed and they lost the commons indeed. what could you do with them? You got rid of them by sending them into slavery in the New World, or they didn't call it slavery. Very direct.
Well, that is a very interesting point. Can I just pick up about this? You see, the people who actually ran these schemes, these labour schemes and this colonisation scheme and the factories and the plantations and this new mercantile capitalism, they never called any of this slavery, of course. But the interesting thing is, did anybody else? And the answer is yes. Contemporaries who were not actually involved in what was going on often did use the word slavery. And so we read in an official report in the 1660s on the nature of life in Barbados, we read in the official report the word slavery is used about the indentured servants in an official government report by an official observer who is sent to actually see what is happening in the colony. And we read again and again various people who survey the scene about, and they use this word slavery. And for example, a man called Ned Ward, a well-known popular writer in London at the end of the 17th century, he writes a book called London Spy, and he talks about people being inveigled off to work in the colonies, and he says, you know, these are people inveigled into slavery. He uses the word slavery. If you go into the early 18th century, Daniel Defoe writes in 1722, he writes Moll Flanders, and in it, Moll, she of course is herself, of course, is a thief who gets deported, and of course he puts in the writer puts into her mouth the words that of course been sent as an indentured servant, of which he says more properly called slaves.
In 1760, the Virginia Gazette runs a large piece, making the same point.
Yeah. And so this again and again, you see this word used by those who are not actually directly involved.
Yeah, right here.
What impact do you think your book will have on the traditional view of the development of slavery across the Atlantic? And if it's not the impact you would hope for, then why do you think that will be?
Maybe you should answer. Well, the book is about to be published by an American publisher, so it's not published in America yet. So it'll be very interesting to see in fact, what impact, if any, it does have in America. So we'll actually wait and see what that might be.
So, if you look at the website of of the organisation which is promoting the 400th anniversary of America, which is happening now. It's 400 years ago that the Virginia Company set up its first successful settlement in Virginia, and this is now the Queen's gone over there to celebrate it. Prince Bush, etc. Lots and lots of American cavalcade over the beginning of America, etc. And we were looking at some of the promotions, and one of them says "Thank you, America," and there are lots of T-shirts run by all kinds of disparate Americans for all kinds of races, and they name "Thank you, John Smith," "Thank you, Diggers," "Thank you, blah 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 blah. There's all kinds of people there from all races, but the interesting thing is, and there are black slaves, there are white slavers, there are Native Americans. As I said, there are African Americans who were slaves. There isn't one name which you can say is an indentured servant or a convict. This has been wiped out. They still won't recognise that 3/4 of the people who went to America from Europe in this colonial period were indentured servants, and a good number of those were appallingly treated. But you wouldn't believe it if you looked at the website, if you looked at the celebrations. So I think we'll be up against it. I think it's very unlikely that it will make a deep impression.
Well, a good example of that, in fact, because I looked at exactly the same thing. This is from the official website to celebrate 400th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown, and it says here, the Jamestown settlement brought people from throughout the Atlantic basin together to form a society that drew upon the strengths and characteristics of English, European, African and Native American cultures. A complete poppycock. I mean, they had no idea that there was such a thing as Native American culture or African culture. I mean, this is just, I mean, these people live in Clyde Cuckoo land here still today, after all these years and after everything that has been written about this place and is known about it. And they go on and say, the economic, political, social institutions that developed during the first 9 decades of the existence of Jamestown continue to have profound effects in the United States, particularly in English common law and cross-cultural relationships. Now, just in case, that is such astonishing nonsense to find this written today, and it's no accident to find out that the same people who are responsible for writing this complete and utter a mishmash and distortion of history, of their own history, I actually decided that one other great thing they would do to celebrate the finding of modern America, if you like, was they took a little fragment of from a packing case that had been sent to America, to Jamestown, and it's a little brass plaque that just is a postal address, if you like, that had been tacked on to a packing case of supplies sent to Jamestown in the very early 1600s. And all it says in this little brass plaque is Jamestown. So what did they decide to do with this brass plaque to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the founding of modern America? They put it on board the space shuttle Atlantis and blasted it into space. I mean, so that is the kind of sort of view, and I think that seems to me as a sort of wonderful symbol of where this kind of view is coming from and where it's going.
Yeah. Okay, hold on a second. Hold on, wait for a microphone. Wait for a microphone.
Don, with all respect, as a product of American education and someone who did a doctorate in history, I can tell you that from about age 14, when you first have your American history, this is in every textbook throughout, although we don't have a national curriculum in the United States, indentured servants, and much of what you've been saying, not the beautiful nuance and subtlety that you've had this evening, but is mentioned, and there's definite recognition. As a sidebar, knowing personally some of the people who are tied in with this 400-year celebration in colonial Williamsburg, I don't mean to belittle them, but this is the colonial dames of America, the daughters of the American Revolution. It is a private group of, frankly, white descendants who are in their own little, as you say, little world, and they're not at all representative of the larger historical consciousness within the United States. And on one hand, it's tragic, frankly, because they are a private group. This is not tied in with any government, be it state or national agency. Williamsburg is a completely private enterprise, as is Jamestown, etc. And I think that has to be recognized because it's literally a group of sweet old women who are running the show, who've got a very particular vision of America there that they're, promoting.
Well, I emailed, I think it must have been 60 American historical societies, asking if I could, for help with anyone who was descended from indentured servants. I got one reply. Maybe that it's.
I think the plus.
Oh, hold on. There you go.
I'm not in the cusp of youth, and I'm saying going back to at least the 70s, truly. In the most common textbooks in secondary schools across America, there's a pretty good, vigorous discussion of indentured service, and that whole debt, it's, the labor force, and much of what you said, for example, 3/4 of the colonial population, for example, Virginia and Maryland, not less so up in New England. And all I'm trying to get at is that there's a consciousness there, and I don't know which historical societies, again, you're approaching, but the joy of joys, I would say, is if you were at the universities and the people who are writing textbooks, albeit more work can be done, and what you've done is a terrific contribution. But I just want to point out, though, that there is, there's consciousness about this, albeit there can be more path-breaking work.
Well, that's absolutely true. There is indeed, and there's been some excellent work done by some notable people: Theodore Allen, David Gallinson, and so on, Urchins, and so on. But the point that we're making is that nobody has actually looked at the totality of this, and also actually finally said economically, what really were these indentured servants? There is a way in which almost every single academic historian in America basically weasels away from actually the fact of the slavery, and there's an attempt even by economic historians, one finds, to basically say this was a straightforward deal here. This was a contract. It was perfectly okay. Our view is, you see, that there is a temptation to slide away and to think that there is only one type of slavery, and that slavery is a very distinct thing that only happened, to the Africans who arrived, rather than it actually being a possibility, which we know in history, that there are actually different types of slavery. So our viewpoint is that while also, and indeed in our book, we do actually pay cognizance to some of these excellent people in modern academic America. But I think that they basically, it's quite often, you see, my point is, one shouldn't necessarily leave it to an historian to actually decide how to define terms. It is actually quite often more a philosophical matter. And I think that what has happened is that quite often these historians have refused to face up to the philosophical matter of defining the terms. And that is what I hope that we have tried to do. I mean, maybe we're wrong, but it's what we've tried to do. And I hope to some extent, maybe we have succeeded.
Over here, yeah.
I was just wondering if you're aware of the work of Marcus Rediker and Peter Limebo's The Many-Headed Hydra, which covers this period, and the Hydra is considered the commoners, the sailors, the huge variety of people that became indentured servants before the beginning of the slave trade. And I wondered if you were familiar with that work.
We've seen it. I can't, we've looked at so much. I must admit, I've certainly seen it, but I couldn't say it jumps into my consciousness immediately.
Well, hold on. Over here, somebody who hasn't had a question yet. Go on the other side.
Hi. I'm just thinking, with this work that you're doing, what implications, because there's always parallels with the present, and what implications you're thinking of for that period in American history of immigration from Europe through the 20th century, and kind of the construct of race and this idea, because what you're implying sort of through your work is that maybe the white American and the black American, this is a spectrum, and that maybe concepts of the South, because it's also tying into the idea of the poor white in the South, the planet owner, and the idea of the black slave, and the kind of the African Americans and the poor whites, those kind of tensions. You're kind of feeding in ways to understand that a little bit better. I mean, are you thinking that when you do the research? Are you making parallels with maybe the 60s onwards in the 20th century?
I don't think that we were consciously trying to do that, but it's very interesting that you're bringing up this issue of race. There's actually a very good book written about this by a man called Theodore Allen, whose name I just mentioned recently. He wrote a book called The Invention of the White Race. And he posits, his theory is that for a long period of history, you didn't have this idea of race as we understand it today. What you had, based on color and so on, what you had was you had Christians and you had Mohammedans and so on. And it was more to do with a cultural religious divide. And that when it came to the problems of having white servants and black servants, because it has to be remembered that the Africans, when they were first brought in, shipped into America, actually had lived in the same conditions. They did not initially have slavery for black Africans in perpetuity, nor was it hereditary. This actually developed. Theodore Allen's view is that as this developed to divide and rule, and to create this sense of the divide in race, that therefore you whites, you may be slaving for nothing under the blazing sun on the plantation together with the blacks, but you're a better class of slave, you see, because you're actually of our cultural type, whereas these other chaps, they're not Christians, you see, so therefore they have less rights, and they're not looked upon as being at the same cultural level as a Christian, because they aren't, you see. And in fact, there's a really interesting story told by Ligon, the guy I mentioned about, and he was riding around a state, visiting one of these sugar estates in Barbados, when he met this African worker who spoke really good English. And the African told him that for having mixed with Europeans for the first time, the greatest thing that he wanted in his life was to actually be baptized and become a Christian. And Ligon went and told the overseer about this man and said, look, we should actually get this man on Sunday and get him baptized in the church. And the overseers went completely bananas and said, what? This is a monstrous idea. And Ligon was taken aback. He said, well, why? He said, because if he's a Christian, we have to give him all these rights. And when he's no longer a Christian, we can treat him like dirt, you see? So that the whole thing about race is a part of the story. It's a very interesting issue.
One last one here.
That's actually really interesting, because I've been looking at my own family history and discovered, shock horror, that in Maine, in the 18th century, they were slave owners. But of course they went to church, and you know, if you read the historiography of the 18th century in that area, I mean, black servants went to church. It was a special place for them, a meeting house. And in fact, the other thing that I've come across in the records are the presence of a lot of mulatto children. I don't know who the parents are, but they show up in the church records as well. So again, I'm just wondering whether you're looking at something which is very particular to a time and place, rather than something you could say generally about all of the 13 colonies.
Okay, the very last one here. Go ahead.
Perhaps can you tell me again, how did it actually stop? At what point were they no longer bringing English convicts over to the States and listen with African slaves? Were they cheaper or easier to get? Or?
Convicts were a better bargain, it was seen at the end. It stopped because of the war, because there was a great reaction by existing settlers to the idea of being used as a dump. They were terrified of disease, they were terrified of lawlessness brought, they thought, by the convicts, and maybe they were right. But there were great epidemics of what was called jail fever, and there was a great campaign to stop this. Always, continually, local assemblies, the Virginia Assembly, the Pennsylvania Assembly, the Maryland Assemblies, all of them were introducing laws to restrict the convicts, but they were always overborne by London. In fact, one area we'd like to have looked at was the impact of convicts on American reaction against England. I'm sure it was part of it. But it ended with American independence. They weren't going to have any more English convicts, although
they still had Irish convicts sent to.
Well, you're right, you got, aren't you? But they were still smuggled in for a few years. But no, they couldn't. There was no chance of them accepting convicts again. As for indentured servitude, it died out. It became less economic within a very short period, because indentured servants were coming from across Europe, and oddly, so were convicts. I found out that in the first American immigration law was introduced because the Germans were sending their convicts to America. This is in the 19th century. They were giving them tickets and sending them to America to just get lost. And the Americans got a bit upset about this.
But to put a final note on this, I was recently in Brazil and discovered that Brazil has the largest growing slave population in the world. And there were last year 28,000 slaves working in the northeastern provinces of Brazil. Now they're 35,000. And all of these are working for 2 American companies. So little seems to have changed. And I want to thank you guys very much. Mike Walsh and our good friend. Thanks very much. Thank you.